So in this video, we're going to learn the last method that we can use to find a zero or find a solution of a quadratic formula or a quadratic function. It's called the quadratic formula. Honestly, you can use this anytime you want. If you want to stick to this method and just use this all the time, you can. However, sometimes it's going to be easier to just take the square root if you just have an x squared, or sometimes it's going to be easier to factor those really easy factorable questions. If you really just don't want to go ahead and complete the square, you can go ahead and use this formula, and it's kind of like a way that you can always rely on. Now, the catch is sometimes you may not always have this formula, so that's the only thing, or may have to look it up or something. So this formula is, again, we're going to mainly be using it when we have something that's unfactorable, and the formula is that you can get x. So x is going to equal to negative b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So a, b, and c are just talking about if you have a trinomial, ax squared plus bx plus c. So a, b, and c are your coefficients here, and then I guess c is your constant. So let's go ahead and in this equation, the first thing we're going to do obviously is we're going to set equal to 0. The quadratic formula only works for finding a 0. So if it's not finding a 0, you have to go ahead and move everything over, just like with factoring, to find a 0. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to label our a, b, and c. But just like with factoring, I always suggest go ahead and take out that greatest common factor. So here my greatest common factor is going to be 2. So if I take out 2, I'm just going to make my number smaller and easier to work with. And so since I'm doing it to everything, it's not really going to change the value of any of the equation, but it's just going to make my number smaller and easier to work with. So now I'm going to label all of my terms, all of my coefficients here. So my 2 is going to be my a, 1 is going to be b, and then negative 5 is going to be c. I underlined here just to make sure that I'm using the sign. So 2 and 1 were positive, but the negative 5, the c here, was negative. And so now all we have to do is plug into our formula. So x is going to equal to negative b, so negative 1 plus and minus the square, plus and minus b squared, which is just the square root of b squared. So b squared is just going to be 1 squared, which is just the number 1, minus 4ac. So 4 times 2 times negative 5, all over twice a. So twice a, you can either calculate it in your mind, or you can just put it there and then calculate later. So 2 times 2 obviously is going to be 4. And so now let's just go ahead and compute this. We're going to have negative 1 plus and minus the square root of 1. And then here I have negative 4 times 2 is 8. And negative 8 times negative 5 is going to be a positive 40. All over 2 times 2, which is 4. So here I'm going to have negative 1 plus and minus the 1 and the 40 become a square root of 41 over 4. Now there's no way to simplify this, so this is basically my answer here. So I have 2 zeros. Remember, this is 2 answers. This is negative 1 plus the square root of 41 over 4, and negative 1 minus the square root of 41 over 4. But again, these are my zeros. It is a decimal. Okay, so now let's try this next one. So in this next one, we're finding the solutions when you get out of 2, so not a 0. And so just like with factoring, this only works when we have a 0. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to move over the 2. And now we have 0 is equal to n squared minus 2n minus 2 equal to 0. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to use our quadratic formula. So there is no number in front of the n squared, so we're just going to put a 1 here. So this is my a, and then my b is negative 2, and my c is negative 2. And there was no way to make these numbers any smaller because there was no greatest common factor between 1, -2, -2. So we're just going to go ahead and use the numbers that we have. And so in this case, x is going to equal to negative 2 is going to be a positive 2 plus and minus the square root of b squared, which is negative 2 squared, which is 4, minus 4 times a times 1 times negative 2, all over twice a. So 2 times 1 is just 2. And so now let's go ahead and continue computing this. So inside of my square root, I'm going to have 4 minus 4 times 1 is negative 4 times negative 2 is positive 8 over 2. And so your answer here would be x is equal to 2 plus and minus the square root of 12 all over 2. Now, this here is going to simplify a lot. First of all, we can simplify this square root here. So remember, the perfect square 4 goes into 12. And so we're going to simplify that into 2 plus the square root of 4, which is 2 times the square root of 3, all over 2. And then now you can actually simplify these fractions. This is actually a fraction, 2 over 2, which is 1. And then here, 2 square root 2 over 2 is also just 1 square root 2. So we don't need to write that one. We can just write square root 3. And that's it. So it's 1 plus and minus the square root of 3. So again, this is two answers. One of them is 1 plus the square root of 3, and the other one is 1 minus the square root of 3. So this is the end of this video, and then I hope that you guys have found this helpful. So this is really nice for someone who just kind of wants something to plug in. Again, you have to be really good at like multiplying and dividing and making sure that you can simplify things, but this kind of always works.